In this section, we'll be talking about China's Shang Dynasty. Before we go too much, though, into the Shang, we need to talk about the issue of unity. China has the exact same problems, in a sense, as India, in that it was divided by language, geography, and distance. However, China is going to have more success in overcoming those divisions. And as we go through the lectures associated with this section on China, we'll try and highlight why that is. But first of all, while we have this nice map up here, I do want to note the difference in language. People in the north of what would become China speak a very different language. Today we call it Mandarin, and it's kind of the official language. But other people in the north didn't speak that language, and people down here in Guangdong speak their own language. Oftentimes, for example, Cantonese is spoken. If you like Hong Kong movies or Jackie Chan, most of those are actually in Cantonese rather than Mandarin. In Shanghai and areas in eastern China over here, still more languages are spoken. So the key point is, even though we may say that there's a language called Chinese, usually what people are referring to when they say Chinese is Mandarin, which is only one of multiple different dialects, which are mostly mutually unintelligible, right? The people can't understand each other. For example, if you're a person from the north up here and you speak Mandarin, and then you're around people who speak Cantonese, you probably aren't going to understand them unless you actually understand Cantonese itself. The geography is not quite as diverse as India, and that might have had an effect. There's not as much, for example, jungle in China, but there still is. There's deserts, there's plains, there's hills, there's semi-tropical areas. There's certainly plenty of geographical diversity. And of course, China, like India, is really, really big. So, like I said, China is going to have the same issues with unity that India does. But whereas India is going to pretty much stay a civilization that sometimes is unified as a state, China is going to be a civilization that is usually unified as a state. And those times when it's divided seem really, really weird to Chinese people. So that brings us now to the Shang. Now, one thing I want to point out, sometimes when Americans see this word, Shang, they want to pronounce it Shang. But usually in Chinese and actually both Japanese, as a kind of tip, the A's are long. So it's not Shang and it's not, for example, Shang, it's Shang. So the Shang Dynasty lasts for about 450 years, from approximately 1500 to 1050 BC. And we call it China's first historical dynasty. Now, I need to explain why that's in quotation marks. Chinese historians in particular claim other dynasties before the Shang Dynasty. They claim that there were other dynasties governing states before the Shang Dynasty. This is the first one that we have really good archaeological proof of, so we call it a historical dynasty. But there's a good chance that Chinese history can reasonably stretches before the Shang Dynasty. It's just this is the first one we really have a lot of concrete evidence about. Now, if you look at the map, you'll notice that once again our theme continues. This is the Shang Dynasty. We'll talk about the Zhou Dynasty later, but this is the approximate territory of the Shang Dynasty. It's always changing, but you'll notice at the center is a river, the Yellow River. So that continues our typical theme of people like to form civilizations around rivers, or rather, rivers make it easy to form a civilization. Now, there's a term I'm going to be using a lot when I talk about Chinese history. And I've used it before in class, but it's not been as important. But I need to really stress it for Chinese history. And that is, what is a dynasty? A dynasty refers to a ruling family. So when there's a change of dynasty, that means the ruling family changed, right? So the dynasty refers to a ruling family. When the family changes, you have a new dynasty, and usually we change the name of the dynasty at that point. So the Shang Dynasty means that there was a particular family, maybe, and it doesn't necessarily mean that was the family name, but it just means there's a particular family ruling China. When the Shang are overthrown, a new family will take over, and they will establish the Zhou Dynasty. So whenever you have a change in dynasty, it means a change in ruling family. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, I mean, usually when like there's a change in who rules a country, there are big changes, right? Because usually this is associated with war, with famine. A lot of times the ruling family was getting weak, and now you've got a strong, vigorous ruling family, so there's a lot of change. So that's one reason we do it. But also, quite simply, that's how the Chinese do it, and we're following their style, right? The Chinese divide up their history into dynasties, so it kind of makes sense for us to do the same. Now, you'll notice there's a couple cities here. And this city of Anyang, that's very important. That's the last capital of the Shang. And there were a lot of very interesting discoveries there, archaeologically speaking. We have some text from some written records from the Shang, but similar in a sense to the Harappan civilization, we have to try and piece together a lot based on archaeology. And here is one of the kinds of things that were found at Anyang. Right? You may think that this is a stone, but this is actually a tortoise shell. Right? This is a tortoise shell, a turtle shell. And someone has written on it, and they have burnt it. One thing we haven't talked a lot about in this class so far is the issue of divination. Basically, it's kind of like fortune telling. People in the ancient past wanted to know what would happen in the future, and they had devised various mechanisms for trying to figure out what would happen in the future. And one that the Chinese used is that they would ask a question writing on a turtle bone. So they would say something like, will the queen give birth to a son? Is now a good time to invade another country? So they were yes or no questions. And then they would burn the shell after writing the characters on it, and they would write like yes or no on the shell, and then if it burnt through the yes part, they would say, okay, yeah, we should do this. Burnt through the no part, say, oh no, we shouldn't. That's kind of how it worked. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that gives you the idea. So this tells us a couple things. One, it tells us they were advanced enough that they developed this whole mechanism of divination. It also tells us that they had writing. And it tells us a little bit, and other archaeological discoveries tell us a little bit about how religion worked in ancient China. And it's different to a large degree from what we've seen in other places. And especially in terms of how religion worked with rule, with governance of the state. So, like I said, the Chinese and many ancient cultures, not just the Chinese, we're just focusing on them because we have all this archaeological evidence, practiced something called divination. And usually the idea was to figure out either what was going to happen in the future or what you should do to bring about some desired effect, right? Trying to figure out, will it rain? Is it going to, will the queen give birth to a son or not? Or, should I invade another country or not? Now, what's interesting, though, about the Chinese is while they believed in gods, a lot of the times they addressed their requests about divination or other prayers to ancestors, typically royal ones. So it's kind of interesting here, right? In a sense, the Chinese gods are more human because they once were human. A lot of the gods we've been talking about are other than people. They're very different. They were always gods. But for the Chinese, while they did believe, like I said, in gods, they also believed in ancestral spirits who were very, very important in Chinese religion. And typically the royal ones, right, the ones associated with the ruling family of the Shang Dynasty, were considered particularly powerful. Now, while there were diviners, people who were trained in how to read these tortoise shells, they were important, but really, the main priest, in a sense, was the king. The king was the mediator, in a sense, the priest, between humans on one side and a high god known as heaven. We won't go into it much in this class, but you can kind of think heaven is kind of like God from a Christian, Jewish, Islamic perspective. Not the exact same, but similar. And ancestors who kind of became like God, since they're spirits, on the other. So in China, you don't really have a separate church or religion from the state. The state is firmly in control of religion. I'm not saying there's not religious specialists or religious leaders, but my point is the key religious leader is the king. He's the one that's really in charge of most religious activities. And even if he doesn't carry them out himself, he's in charge of figuring out who can. And like I said, it's also a very important note that the king's ancestors are believed to become powerful spirits after they die who still intervene in the kingdom. So the royal family then is very powerful, very close to the spirit world. And as you can see here, then religion is firmly under state control. And what's interesting is early Chinese texts say that the major affairs of state are two: sacrifice, meaning religion. Religion typically was sacrifice. Now that could be human sacrifice, but it also meant offering of wine or meat or vegetables or things like that to the gods or the ancestral spirits, and war. So the state had kind of two big jobs: sacrifice, keeping the gods happy, keeping the relationship between humanity and the spirits good, and fighting. Now, one thing, I have this image here. This also shows us that the Shang were very good at making bronze. This is a ritual vessel. This would have been used in performing sacrifices for the gods. And I just want to stress, when I say sacrifice, don't think necessarily human sacrifice. They did do that on occasion, but it was typically other kinds of sacrifices. But that's the sort of thing that they would make, right? And this shows us, first of all, that they could make bronze, but also they had a high level of ability. I mean, that, I think, is a very impressive piece of bronze work. Another example, though, of the bronze the Shang would make, you can see here. This is another kind of vessel probably used in some sort of ritual circumstances. But one thing that's really cool about it, you'll notice that it has writing inside. So we know they also had written language. We saw that with the tortoise shell. And one thing I love about the Shang was they also had books. Now, they didn't have paper yet, but they did write on bamboo, right? These are bamboo strips, and they would tie, the strings aren't here, but they would tie these together as a kind of book. And it's interesting, by the way, Chinese is traditionally read, when you read it, you don't, in English, we read left to right like this, but Chinese read up to down like this, from right to left. So they have writing. Now, there's something very important about their writing. This is very difficult, I think, for people who are speak Western languages as their native language. So if you speak English or Spanish or French or something as your first language, this can be kind of hard to understand, but please follow as best you can. Chinese is spoken differently, but written the same. Right? Chinese is spoken differently, but written the same. And you may say, that's really weird. How does that work? Because what happens, in English and Spanish and French, when letters don't have any intrinsic meaning, right? When you write letters, they don't mean anything. It's just a sound. What happens is you put the letters together, and those sounds make a word, and that word means something. So what happens is English is spoken and written, right? And uses the same words, the same sounds, and so forth. But here is what's interesting. In Chinese, each character, each little image here, each one of these has a meaning that is independent of the sound. So if you mispronounce a word in English, or if you misspell a word, it can mean something completely different because of that close connection. But in Chinese, there's not that close connection between how something is said and how it is written. That may sound really confusing. Let me give you a concrete example to make this clear. First of all, this is the ancient way of writing Chinese. This is the modern way. So there was some development, but you can see how they're similar, right? I'm going to look at this word heaven. Now, in Mandarin Chinese, this character is pronounced, that means heaven, is pronounced tian. It means heaven. Koreans would borrow Chinese, but they don't pronounce this tian, they pronounce it chun. Sounds somewhat similar, but it's different, right? The Japanese also borrowed this character and pronounced it ten. If you were to have a Chinese, Japanese, and Korean person in a room, and they were each to say, well, I'm thinking of chun, or I'm thinking of tian, or I'm thinking of ten, they wouldn't have any idea what they were thinking unless they knew Japanese or Korean or Chinese, right? They'd have to know all three languages. But if any one of those people, if that Chinese person, that Japanese person, that Korean person wrote this, they would instantly understand it. They would understand the meaning. Oh, you mean heaven, right? If we had a person, a native English speaker, a native Spanish speaker, and a native French speaker, and they each said the word for heaven in their respective languages, none of them would understand it unless they knew the other language. However, and also if they wrote it, none of them would understand it. The Chinese, Japanese, and Korean person, if any of them said the word for heaven, none of them would understand it. But they wrote it, they all would understand it. So the key point I need to stress here is that because in Chinese there's a difference, a gap between how something is pronounced and its meaning, it was possible for people to speak the language differently but write it the same. So it doesn't matter what Chinese dialect you speak. It doesn't matter if you're Japanese or Korean and you pronounce this differently. You can read this and understand it. So what this meant was that even though Chinese people spoke different languages, they would share a written language, right? They spoke differently, but when they read the same. And this allowed for a unified high culture. It meant that educated Chinese people, didn't matter what part of China they were in, they would read the same books, right? They would read the same books and therefore come to hold the same ideas about how the world worked. We'll talk more about the philosophies and to a certain extent the histories that influenced Chinese people. But what I want to stress is the people who govern, the elites, the people in charge, it doesn't matter what part of China they're in. It doesn't matter if they will speak different languages. They write the same language and they share the same worldview, and that's key to keeping their country unified. In India, they didn't have a shared written language. They had alphabets that they used that were similar, but they did not have a shared written language they could all read. So that made it harder to govern. It made it harder to share ideas. In China, it's much easier to do so. And we have to stress, today the spoken word is probably more important because of things like the internet and YouTube and cell phones. But here, the only way to communicate with people far away is through the written word. So having a shared written language is key to holding everything together. Now, to continue, we know also a little bit about the Shang from their archaeology. And I think a good way to kind of give us a sense about who the Shang were would be to look at the tomb of a very remarkable woman. And this is her tomb. This was discovered in the 1970s, and it was really a big deal because it had not been robbed. People would bury important things in tombs and valuable things, and so people would go and rob them. But this tomb had never been robbed. And the archaeology of this tomb can tell us a bit about women and society during Shang Dynasty China. So first of all, this is the tomb of a woman known as Lady Hao or Fu Hao, and she died about the year 1200 BC. So this is a very old tomb. Now, what's really fascinating about Lady Hao was she was the favorite wife of the king. Now, if I was to say, my wife is my favorite wife, that's not very impressive, I guess, because, I've only got the one. I do think it's impressive that she can put up with me and has put up with me for this many years. But in any case, I'm married to exactly one wife. Lady Hao, Fu Hao, was one of 64 wives. The Shang king, in order to try and hold together his country, the Shang, China, married a lot of women from very important families. That's why he had so many wives, right? I mean, 64 is a lot. Yeah, that's a lot of wives. So what was key was a lot of this was political. But among those wives, Lady Hao was very special. Like I said, she was known as his favorite. Well, why? Well, she was an educated advisor. She was someone who knew how to read and write. And through her ability to read and write, had learned a lot. And so gave him good advice. And if I recall correctly, books were found in her tomb. As a general rule, you bury people with things they use. So when you bury someone with books, there's a good chance that means that they are literate. It's not 100%, but there's a good chance. In addition, she was buried with items made of bronze, your typical bronze vessels that we talked about. That, again, that shows the wealth and the kind of advanced artistic talent of the Shang. This it's very idealized, but my understanding is that this is an owl, right? You can see his talons down here. I think these are the tufts of his feathers, and there's his beak and eyes, but that's an owl, and it's very stylized, but I think it is an impressive piece of artwork. In addition, weapons were found in the tomb, and it would appear that not only did Fu Hao advise her husband about going to war and how to fight war, but actually would be on the battlefield herself and help actually lead the troops. So that's kind of an interesting place for women to hold in Chinese societies. We'll talk about later that changes. In addition, jade, lots of jade was found in her tomb, and that tells us that they were wealthy. But also ivory was found in the tomb, and that's impressive because ivory does not naturally occur where the Shang are, right? To get ivory, you need access to rhinoceri, you need elephants, or elephants and rhinos are the big ones. And so that must mean that the Shang were engaged in some kind of international trade. So we can tell a lot from a society based on its archaeology. One thing that's perhaps a little disturbing is that there were the skeletons of the skeletons of dogs found in her tomb. They appear to have been sacrificed to accompany her in the afterlife, as well as other people, apparently slaves, who were also sacrificed. And when you see that kind of human sacrifice, that means you have a very hierarchical society where the people on top can tell people below them what to do, even tell them, hey, you guys are going to die with me. You know, someone's got to serve me in the afterlife. Really, being a slave is really terrible, but you still got to be a slave even when you're dead. That's really bad, right? So there was this understanding of hierarchy that was believed to be normal and natural. So normal and natural, it would continue on into the afterlife. And you can see this kind of power that was held over people who had lower status because they could just be killed to accompany and serve their masters in the afterlife. Now, one thing I want to point out, I've talked quite a bit about human sacrifice in this section. This wasn't just the Chinese. A lot of other people did this. This was done in Egypt, for example, Mesopotamia, Sumer. A lot of these people we talked about also practiced human sacrifice. So I'm not trying to pick on the Chinese. I just want to point that out. Though I should point out one thing that's interesting is in a lot of tombs, you have you'll find like clay dolls, and a lot of times what happened, civilizations decided not to sacrifice people anymore. They just would use those kind of clay dolls. But that brings us to the end of the Shang Dynasty for now. We'll pick up with them and the Zhou later on.